Hello everybody. After running dozens of different shrimp tanks over the years, I have come to a conclusion. Something that many people may overlook, and even myself sometimes forget just how important of an aspect it is with our shrimp tanks. And that is the light we have on our shrimp tanks. I put out a recent video explaining how the best thing you can do for your shrimp is to make their home a natural, balanced planted tank. And in my opinion, one of, if not the very most important aspect of keeping a balanced, natural, planted shrimp tank is your light. Literally everything living in your tank depends on the light. And all life revolves around the light, and I want to explain how and why the light is so important. Then I'll cover some of the technical terms lights use so you know what to look for. And lights don't last forever. So I'll talk about things to look for when it's time to replace your old light. Everything, and I mean everything, revolves around your light. Just like everything on planet Earth depends on the sun for life as we know it in some form or another, the light in your planted shrimp tank is the source of life. It is the engine that makes your planted shrimp tank go. Essentially what we are trying to do in a balanced, natural planted shrimp tank is mimic nature in a glass box with an artificial light. We may never ever get it perfect, but if we can find a balance that works for us, then we will have a much better chance at having success with our shrimp and plants in our shrimp tanks. When it comes to how much light we need, it is important to remember that more is not always better, especially when it comes to our shrimp tanks. Remember, our goal is to find a happy balance in our shrimp tanks. We need enough light to support life, but not too much light, and things begin to start going crazy. They go too fast, and it's almost impossible to find a happy balance when you have too much light. I like to say that the intensity of light sets the pace of how fast life progresses in our tanks. Just like it's a lot easier to control a car while driving slow than it would be driving a race car over 100 miles per hour, it is much easier to control a planted shrimp tank that has just enough light to support the desired life we want than it is to control a tank that has too much light. I keep talking about finding a balance in our planted shrimp tanks, but what does that even mean? Keeping a planted tank is pretty much a balancing act. Everything from the light to type of plants to nutrients in the water all need to be happy. All need to be in harmony to support the life we want to promote in our shrimp tanks. All plants need light. It is the number one requirement for plants to live and survive. The more light plants get, the more faster and more they want to grow. The more and more faster they want to grow. So you say, I want my plants to get as big as they possibly can, as quick as they possibly can, so the more light the better. And let's face it, that just is not the case. Back to the balancing act thing. Plants use more light. The amount of light sets the rate of how fast plants can grow, but plants need a host of other things in order to grow. The biggest nutrient other than light that plants need is CO2, and is often the first thing that goes out of whack when we have too much light on our planted shrimp tanks, and is the first thing to cause things to go out of balance. When you have lots of light, you need to inject additional CO2 into your tank to keep things in balance. Like we discussed earlier, the brighter the light, the faster the plants want to grow. But like we just said, plants need more than just light. The biggest nutrient they need next to light is CO2. So if we have too much light and not enough CO2, then that is likely where we'll run into the first imbalance. If you have a super high intensity light, your plants are going to want to grow fast. They can only grow as fast as all the nutrients that they need are available. Not just light, not just CO2, not just nitrates, not just potassium, and so on. If you have more light than you do available nutrients, the plants are only going to grow as fast as what nutrient you have the least will allow. What that means is even if your plants cannot use all the light because of nutrient deficiencies, other forms of life can and will use that light and any other nutrient excesses. These other forms of life that we didn't invite but show up is called algae. Algae is a much simpler form of life and doesn't need as many different kinds of nutrients as plants. Plants need light, CO2, and an endless list of macro and micronutrients to grow and sustain life. Algae, on the other hand, needs light and less number of nutrients. Oftentimes, different forms of algae can be indicative of what kind of nutrients we have in excess of. So if you have an overly bright light, not enough of all the nutrients that your plants need to grow, you'll end up with an excess of light and nutrients. While your plants cannot grow, algae sure can. So the brighter the light, the faster things want to move. The faster things move, the harder it is to keep in balance. So you say, let's go the high-tech route. Have the brightest, most expensive light, injected pressurized CO2, dose fertilizers daily, and it takes all of these things to keep a super high light planted tank to keep in balance with large regular water changes. We got to do a water change every week to reset everything when you put in all these fertilizers. Super bright light, high-tech planted tanks are super awesome. I've even had a couple over the years, but they really are not all that conductive for keeping shrimp. I always say repeatedly, time and time again, the thing that shrimp need more than anything is consistency. And a high light, high-tech planted shrimp tank leaves a lot to be desired when it pertains to shrimp tanks. For one, injecting CO2 messes with pH levels. While CO2 is being injected, it brings the pH down. When CO2 is turned off while the lights are off at night, the pH will rise back up. Shrimp don't like pH swings. If the tank is high enough light, you'll need to add fertilizers every day. Every time you add anything to your shrimp tank, it changes things. Whether that be fertilizer, medication, or even water conditioners, I have always found that my shrimp do best when I add the least amount of additives to my tanks. So now we have covered why it's really hard to have the high light planted shrimp tank, and why more light isn't always good. Let's talk about why we even need a light in plants to begin with. Live plants that are actively growing are one of the best filters we can have. Every time a plant makes a new leaf or stem, it is using up the stuff that we want to get out of our tanks. It's really pretty magical when you think about it. Plants take the nasties like ammonium nitrates and turn them into plant growth. So we need enough light that plants can use up the excess nutrients in our planted shrimp tanks, but not so much light that we start running into imbalances that lead to algae messes. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to balancing out planted shrimp tanks with our lights, and that is different types of plants need different amounts of light and grow at different speeds, and thus use up excess nutrients at different rates. I'll talk more about that in a future video. Here's some technical stuff that you should probably know about lights. Today's LED lights are pretty amazing with how much light they produce, with how little power they use, and how long they last. Lights use many different technical specifications, and I'll go over what some of the most important ones mean. Wattage. In my experience with planted shrimp tanks and the LED lights of today, 1 watt up to 2 watts per gallon have been the sweet spot for me, unless the tank is big or particularly tall. I find that 1 watt of LED power can grow most basic plants that we need in our shrimp tanks without there being too much issue. Again, this is my experience. And as I just mentioned, taller and bigger tanks, that number will be higher per gallon. So while a 20-gallon long tank may not even need a full watt per gallon, a tall 110-gallon tank may need well over 2 watts per gallon. Light color temperature. This is a measurement known as Kelvin. You may see a light with a rating of 6500 K. This means 6500 Kelvin. It refers to the color of the light. 6500 is known as daylight, and I tried to get most of my lights to be in this range. I tried to have most of my lights be in the 6500 range. I have had success from anything from 5K to 8K though. The next thing, PAR. Now you won't see this on too many lights, but it's a value. This is light brightness. The PAR value is always higher, closer to the light. So if you take a PAR reading at the bottom of the tank with the same light, the PAR reading will always be higher on the shorter tank. So that makes sense. The light is always brighter the closer it is to the light. The light is brightest the closer it is to the actual light. That's all that means. And another thing to keep in mind, lights get old and fade with time. What prompted me to make this video about lights is that I just recently had to replace a good number of my own lights. Sure, many of them burn out and quit working completely, but still, many come on every day. They just get dimmer and dimmer over time. For me personally, I noticed that I've had some tanks not doing as well as I would like when it comes to the shrimp breeding. After racking my brain for weeks on what was going on with these tanks, I noticed that they all had one thing in common. The lights on all of these tanks that they just weren't doing as good as I'd like had very old, well past their prime lights. So I got some of the same brand name lights that I've had before, but with a different model and higher wattage and higher light. My conclusion that these old lights were just not getting the job done. It's one of those things that you don't really notice because it comes on every day as it should. It's really not until you put a brand new light on a tank with the same specs as the old light that you realize that, holy crap, that old light wasn't even half as bright as it should be. It just wasn't getting the job done anymore. When I put my new lights on, I've replaced my 40 watt lights with 40 watt lights, and the new 40 watt lights are almost blinding compared to what I've become accustomed to. The lack of plant growth was causing excess nutrients to build up that are usually taken care of by the growing plants. But not enough light equals not enough new plant growth, which equals an unhappy shrimp tank. So, in conclusion, light is the engine that makes our planted shrimp tanks go. Literally every single thing in a planted shrimp tank depends hugely on the light. It very well may be the most important piece of equipment on your shrimp tank. I think some of us, including myself, don't always put enough thought into our lights. And it can be one of the most confusing aspects for a newer shrimp keeper to figure out. I hope these little bits of info I shared about planted shrimp tank lights help some of you guys. Thank you all for watching. Bye.